Just want to get started here talking about the Backrooms therapist perspective because I just saw the movie. So let me know if I how my audio is. Let's see how the audio is going. Yes. So I think it's a really good, let's see, MacBook Pro speaker. Let's see. Mic. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the movie. So I actually was able to see it last night at a premiere, and I think I was able to see it the way it was meant to be, um, at a large theater that forces you to feel as though you are there in the back rooms in the nauseating fluorescent yellow glow of 90s office core buildings, along with the film's protagonist. So the movie's called Backrooms. It loses the from the YouTube series. So essentially, for those who don't know, Backrooms is a film that just came out yesterday. It is a psychological horror movie based on a YouTube series that came out in 2022. So it was created by a then 16-year-old, and he used Blender and Adobe Photoshop, I believe. So the Backrooms was a legend from 2019 and 4chan. And so um, the yellow rooms with no windows and fluorescent lights, that was the aesthetic. And there was an image, and it was actually from a building, um, a hobby shop in Wisconsin. And so this image, though, was creepy and eerie enough that it garnered a lot of public concern and imagination because it was this sort of 90s fluorescent purgatorial liminal space. And so that gets into this jump off point for horror, especially something called creepy pastas, which are creepy stories on Reddits that are related to liminal spaces. And so, speaking of that, a liminal space, I should define it: empty or abandoned places that appear eerie, forlorn, and often surreal. Liminal spaces are commonly places of transition pertaining to the concept of liminality, which just means a quality of ambiguity or disorientation that occurs in the middle stage of a rite of passage when participants no longer hold their pre-ritual status but have not yet begun the transition to the status that they will hold when the rite is complete. So it's standing at the threshold. Okay, so it's a time of passing from one thing to another. So think creepy hallways, waiting rooms, 90s fluorescent light buildings. You can't see what's coming next. You know where you've been, you don't know where you're going. Okay, so empty classrooms with chairs is an example given on Wikipedia. It's very creepy. Why? The purpose of the building isn't being fulfilled. So keep all this in mind. This is the milieu of the late 2010s and early 2020s horror that Kane Parsons, the now 21-year-old, barely old enough to drink, director of the movie Backrooms, came of age in, and he helped to form it again. So he took the Backrooms mythos of Reddit and the images there, the still shot images, and created a YouTube found footage horror series. And it did so well, it's got tens of millions of views, that it was transformed into a horror movie that just came out. And I had the privilege of seeing it. Well, all of the preamble, all of the to do and hullabaloo, let's jump in. So keep that concept of liminality in mind, and we'll talk about it more. But the movie begins in 1990 as scientists from the Async Research Institute watch recovered footage from a fellow researcher, Naren Warren, who went on an expedition into a large extra-dimensional space known as the Backrooms, was separated from his group. And he's pursued, and the individual we're watching is navigating with the camera, trying to find his way back to an entrance in this wide windowless corridor, bright yellow fluorescent and carpeted hell area. And we see he screams, he's trying to find his way out by following basically a la Hansel and Gretel, a trail, but not a breadcrumbs, but a rope. Well, we see out of the corner of the camera movement, and then see some large ambiguous creature, and then we hear screaming. Okay. And the movie cuts away and cuts to the title screen. Amazing intro for those who love found footage horror, such as myself. So we cut to the furniture owner, Clark, struggling to cope with his alcoholism and a recent divorce. So what's interesting is he visits his therapist, Dr. Mary Klein. Okay. So a therapist, a psychologist is part of this movie from the jump. And we'll see why, because she's a good stand in for sanity. And we'll see what happens there. But Clark regularly visits Dr. Mary Klein, who has her own trauma from her. He regularly visits therapist Dr. Mary Klein, who has her own trauma from her schizophrenic mother and the demolition of her childhood home. Okay, so we see in the movie the young Dr. Mary Klein putting her hand in the concrete of the home that her and her mother move into. Okay, and then we see as an adult, Mary keeps the mold, the concrete piece of her young child handprint because the home was later demolished and she took that piece with her to remind her of home. Okay. So while managing the store's dwindling finances, Clark talks to his electrician about the mysteriously high electrical bill and the regularly flickering lights in the furniture store that Clark owns. The electrician finds three colored breaker switches installed at an angle in the distribution board that do not connect to the store. So it's very odd. Open up a breaker box and you see at this weird angle, not lined up in straight rows like normal breakers, like a normal fuse box. You see these that are at an angle. It looked very weird. It looked like someone glued them on in the movie yesterday. So having taken up residence at the store, living there as he lost his home in the divorce, he left the home, lives in the furniture store now, sleeping on a bed there. Clark experiences electrical irregularities in the store that lead him to the basement where he notices a slit on one of the walls where light comes through. Okay. When he goes to investigate it, Clark faces through the wall in an uncanny hallway. So he goes through, and it shows in the movie, it's like a ghost going through the wall when Clark goes through. Okay. He finds Naren's belongings, that earlier explorer in that footage that we see at the beginning of the film. He finds Naren's belongings and narrowly escapes back to the store when an unseen creature chases him out. Okay, so words don't do this justice. I'm going to add a lot of pictures from the movie when I turn this into an article, and the article will be called something akin to the Backrooms and the Dangers of Nostalgia, because the movie is set in 1990, and I believe it is because um, it's very 90s coded, and there's VHS tape, but we see that nostalgia is actually dangerous because it can bite you, and memories aren't always all they're cracked up to be. We transform them. So when I'm looking at this Wikipedia summary, it's all the narrative of the events. And so I'm going to riff for a little bit here without that. So Dr. Mary Klein is a character in her own right here, and we'll hear more about her. I'm going to keep the story going, but and leave and pick up where we left off. But essentially, Dr. Klein is a trying to become a self-help guru. Okay, so she has a book, and that she actually talks on the radio in a tape that Clark is listening to. So not only is Dr. Klein his actual therapist, but she's also creating something like a Lucinda Bassett following, where anybody from the 90s will remember the sort of we could call them self-help video audio cassettes, self-help cassette tapes that people would listen to and put in their car, put at home, like meditation tapes. Like, think of it like self-help influencers now. You have those on YouTube, you have in various places. But in the 90s, you had a lot of Tony Robbins, a lot of other people doing cassette tapes and VHS tapes. So Mary opens up the beginning part of the movie that's non-found footage by saying that we all have loops, the paths of least resistance that we go down with our behaviors, and that we continue to do them and hope that things turn out differently. And so Mary is setting up what we call the repetition compulsion, right? In psychotherapy. And the repetition compulsion is doing the same thing again to receive a different result. Now, people will call that insanity, but really, if you do the same thing with different people, something different could happen with each. So there's always a level of variability in the human creature. and in human relationships. So she opens up with that, which lets us know that there's going to be discussion on self sabotage and self development, because she's mentioning repetitive behavior that we get caught in. That's the easiest, no, sort of familiar responses and behaviors that we embark on. So she says that before meeting with her patient, Clark. Now, we went over how the movie begins with the found footage and then pans to Clark and Dr. Mary talking. Well, what I didn't get into is the fact that we cut into it in the at the final moments of the therapy session. And so in those moments, Dr. Mary suggests that she and Clark role play. And I found it fascinating. So she suggests that they role play, and she pretends to be the Clark's wife. She takes on the role of the wife. Well, interesting stuff. So she accuses him of smelling of alcohol as the wife, and he erupts in anger and then apologizes because he takes the exercise seriously and feels like he's there. And so Dr. Mary says, that's okay. This is, this is the point of it. You can, we're trying to change how you see this. And so then the therapy session ends in his white hot moment of being upset and apologizing. And she said, his therapist says, that's okay. Well, it's very interesting because this role play of Clark's fight with his wife, where he comes home after drinking and Dr. Mary plays the role of the upset wife, saying, why are you home late? He says, I was working. She says, well, you smell of alcohol. Don't lie to me. He says, I had a few beers. She says, to find a few. He says, as many as I need. You're going to law school. I have to work to afford it, because he's a failed architect, apparently. He wanted to be an architect, but he owns a furniture store. So Dr. Mary, in character still, says, it's not my fault that you didn't get to be an architect. And to me, that was really interesting for a therapist to take on that perspective and to be a bit argumentative with the client and to play an adversarial character. I wouldn't do that as a therapist. So this is the therapist reacts part. So this is in the halcyon early days of the heresy known as EMDR. And I joke here, when EMDR was new, it was heavily questioned. Still is, but it's my bread and butter. So I'm biased. I've seen the studies, I've seen research. There's plenty of research for it. And essentially, if Clark had been an EMDR therapy client, Dr. Mary would have had Clark notice that memory of his wife's words, notice the thought that goes along with it, something like, I'm worthless, or I'm not enough, or I'm a bad husband, or I'm a terrible husband, something irrationally bad. Dial that up and desensitize it and say, notice what happens. But Dr. Mary, not being an EMDR therapist and being in a movie that is not made by a therapist, takes on the role of the trauma herself to enact it with Clark. And I found that to be somewhat risky, to be highly razor's edge material, a bit dicey, because honestly, that's not something that is really advisable. You don't want a client to associate you as the therapist with their trauma in that way. So anyway, back to the narrative script here, of what's going on. So let me pivot back to that. So essentially, let me see. Clark tells Mary about the back room. So we just came off of Clark left his therapy appointment, went to live at his furniture store, then discovered the back rooms by finding a strip of light that's vertical up and down, kind of like this. It looks like this, but in the wall. So he finds that, he goes through. All right. So then he escapes. And of course, he goes back to his therapist and tells Mary about the back rooms. She doesn't believe him. Clark recruits his assistant manager, Kat, and her boyfriend, Bobby, to help him find the back rooms for proof, bringing along a trusty camcorder for maximum 90s vintage aesthetic. The trio enters and records their discoveries. When Clark and Kat tie Bobby to a rope as they lower him down a steep sloped corridor, a monster attacks him and Bobby scrambles to climb back up. The creature pulls on his rope while Bobby attempts to untie himself and unalives him, dragging Clark and Kat down the corridor as well. Clark runs through various rooms, including an infinite pool-like room, but comes across several humanoid entities in a Christmas-themed. Hold on one second. In a Christmas-themed room, I'm adding that because that's not in Wikipedia, but I remember it. So Clark runs through various rooms, including infinite pool-like room, but comes across several humanoid entities that chase him to a dead end. And that is in this room with a giant Christmas tree and some humanoid entities that are very frightening. And there's a jump scare there. It's really good. Clark hears Kat call out for him, and he sets down the camera to try to look for her. The camera is then picked up by the creature as Kat screams for Clark to look behind him. Okay. Meanwhile, async scientist Phil watches Clark from his surveillance camera. Now, this is what gets interesting. So we know from the beginning of the movie on the found footage that scientists are exploring this Backrooms place, this yellow fluorescent hell. And so Clark has now found an entry point, a portal to it in his furniture store. So the scientists are still monitoring it. And one of them sees Clark. Okay, keep that in mind. Sometime later, Mary receives a voicemail from Clark saying he will not return. Worried, Mary visits Clark's store and finds the entry to the Backrooms herself. While wandering the halls, she finds an insane Clark who chokes her unconscious. In the real world, Phil is shocked to recognize Clark when an ad for Clark's furniture store plays while Phil is watching TV with his family. Now, this sets in motion, as you expect, quite a bit. So, hats off to Mary, because she is trying to launch her self-help audio recording career, talking about choosing new paths and not going down familiar loops of trauma. Okay. Which for her firsthand experience is her mother put papers and books and obscuring sort of boarded up. Dr. Mary's mother boarded up the home Mary lived in, and it scared Mary as a child with schizophrenic delusions that people were trying to harm Mary and her. So boarding up the home, hoarding, not leaving the home, paranoid schizophrenia delusions, in other words, that Mary grew up with as the daughter of someone with paranoid schizophrenia. So she's had to learn not to fear as well. So her whole career is break the loops of self-sabotage and choosing hurtful patterns. And Clark's hurtful patterns pushing people away. He mentions that early on. He pushes them away. He doesn't want to feel the pain of intimacy, the risks of intimacy, and so he pushes away. So Clark, we've got to the point where Dr. Mary, the psychologist, has entered the back rooms, which you could say is a metaphor for trauma. So you could read this all metaphorically, and we'll get to that in a minute. But a tied up Mary awakens with Clark in a space resembling a dining room. Clark is joined by the still life, imperfect copies the Backrooms makes of humans. Upon revealing Kat's severed head, Clark demands Mary to continue their therapy sessions via role play there in the Backrooms. But Mary chastises Clark about his excuses for his failures, which was why his wife really left him. Clark wishes to stay in the Backrooms, and Mary reassures him that he's his own person with his own freedoms, making Clark untie her. So I think that the Backrooms' most horrific element is failed therapy. So Dr. Mary is tied to a chair after entering the Backrooms and being kidnapped by Clark, who's gone native. He's gone fully Backrooms possessed. He loves this place. He loves the multiple eyes, ears, multiple faced people there that the Backrooms populates, because the Backrooms is revealed to be like this living remembrance, living copy of a copy of a copy of buildings with copies of copies of copies of people in them, like this disembodied ghost, like the ghost of a building with people in it to represent the people that lived there. But it's not quite right. It's like a memory of a memory. And so Clark loves this place. He gets to wallow. He gets to interact with these people who don't judge him, and they feel no pain. He loves that. He gets to sit in his own mind and know that those people will never leave him there, those imperfect copies that don't talk. And so when Clark initiates the role play again with Dr. Mary, who he tied up, and this time he's more aggressive. This time he's the one initiating the exercise, and Dr. Mary is like the client. He's like the therapist. Now, it's still about Clark's own content, but he's taking charge. And Dr. Mary says, your wife really left you because of the whining. Nothing's ever your fault. And you don't change. And he asks how I can, and she says, I don't know. So it's very interesting again to me that this is an era when EMDR therapy existed in the early 90s, and it could have been rare. Hypnosis existed. And so Dr. Mary not knowing how to heal that after her many soliloquies, her speeches about breaking familiar automatic behavior patterns through new patterns, it was disappointing to me. It was disappointing she said, I honestly don't know, versus saying you have to face the trauma head on and not avoid it, because EMDR therapy does that, right? So Clark wishes to stay in the back rooms, and Mary reassures him that he's his own person with his own freedoms, making Clark untie her. Now, he says, that's okay. She says, that's okay. You don't have, he says, I don't want to change. She says, then don't. So Clark's change in behavior triggers the creatures in the back rooms as they try to run away. When another still life appears, this one being a deformed humanoid copy of Clark in a pirate costume. So this doesn't, the description here, let me do it more justice. It's a giant Clark that looks like a caricature. It's a giant, evil looking cartoon. The pirate Clark entity kills the real Clark when the latter tries to calm it down, and Mary flees but sprains her ankle in the process. Cornered in a copy of the furniture store's showroom, so it's a copy of the furniture store showroom. It's not even the real thing. She thinks she's escaped, she hasn't. Cornered in a copy of the furniture storeroom, Mary attempts to fight off Pirate Clark, and it inadvertently triggers a trap that releases gas from some canisters nearby. Mary breaks free, but is accidentally knocked out after startling a group of async scientists in hazmat suits who take her back to the real world in their headquarters. She recovers while the scientists study the captured still life, meaning giant Clark. Now, again, what this is calling still lives, this Wikipedia article, are these sort of ghosts of people, these copies of people that aren't the real person, almost like automatons. And so Dr. Mary is extremely resilient. She escapes. She is rescued by some scientists, all the while fighting this goofy but uncanny and scary version of Clark that's a pirate. So Clark metaphorically let his trauma win, right? So let's do the traumatology analysis now. So Clark is reliving his divorce. He's reliving pushing someone away, insulting his wife, coming home late, avoiding rather than getting close to her, turning to addiction due to stress, okay, and due to not being the architect that he wanted to be. So Clark wallows in those memories. His therapist tries to help him role play his way into a new answer. He doesn't do that. He lives in the showroom of the furniture store that he owns, and he succumbs to exploring the back rooms over and over and enjoying getting lost there instead of being in the real world. So he's getting lost in his own reverie in his own private world instead of making new connections in the real world. And he is so immersed in his trauma, his therapist literally goes into his own trauma, goes into the back rooms. And the back room is like a shared trauma zone. It's like the collective Jungian memory of buildings and trauma, and the versions of people at their worst and most grotesque. And so it's almost like the collective unconscious in a Jungian sense, but of buildings that are holding sort of counterfeit versions of the people that live there. So Dr. Mary goes there to save him, and he still chooses not to leave. He still chooses to say, I choose the trauma. And so when he does that, the traumatized version of him that's less him and more just automatic fight, flight, freeze response unalives him. So the copy, the version of Clark that's his worst impulses, destroys him and goes on living, which is when someone allows their trauma and paranoia to take control. They're living as a shell of their former self, okay? Metaphorically. In this movie, it's literal. So then Mary escapes from Clark's trauma. When he chooses it, he is no longer her patient, right? So she flees the back rooms and she's able to escape. So, okay, Mary is taken to an interrogation room where she meets Phil, who explains, remember Phil from earlier, whose jaw dropped when he saw the Clark on the pirate commercial for Clark's own furniture store. And he remembered he saw Clark also in the grainy surveillance cam for the back rooms. So he connected the dots like, oh my gosh, the back rooms is inside a cheesy pirate furniture store, a pirate themed furniture store. Mary's taken to an interrogation room where she meets Phil, who explains that Async was once a company that developed MRI machines until their mission changed upon the discovery of the Backrooms, with their new objective being to map the whole Backrooms. Phil explains that there have been reports of more doors into the back rooms opening in the surrounding area. Okay, and then as he explains that, the camera pans to back to the back rooms. It shows the new areas that are generating there, including a version of Cat's home, from that couple, Cat and Bobby. So they were living somewhere, and that is now populating the back rooms, like a Chuck E. Cheese type version, right? Like all the buildings look kind of fake versions of the real ones. Like you go look at a children's play place, and they're sort of facsimile, cheesy or cheaper versions of the buildings. Well, that's what happens with the back rooms is the stuff's misspelled. The buildings come up, but their words are backwards. Like a stop sign is backwards in the back rooms. So uh, the camera, as Mary's having this explained to her, pans around to all the new buildings that are from the world we've just seen, the world of this pirate furniture store and surrounding areas, and a version of Mary. Since Mary went there, her human memory went into the back rooms, because when humans go in there, the memories they have of the places they know are added to the back rooms locations. So it's almost like anyone who enters the back rooms brings their trauma and their memories into it, which creates more rooms. It's like if everybody's trauma came together and kept building rooms onto each other physically. So several rooms based on buildings from Mary's memories are shown as Phil is talking, along with a newly formed still life of Mary sitting in a poorly copied interrogation room. Okay. So that's where the movie ends. And we hopefully will get a sequel. I believe we will. So this is an A24 movie, highly artsy, and it all started from a 2022 horror series, um, that honestly was very of its time and ahead of its time. It was what you could call elevated found footage. So the film was wonderful, and who would have thought? I mean, something based on Blender and Adobe After Effects done from the home turned into something this globally recognized. I mean, it's one day after the release, less than really almost 24 hours, maybe a little less or more. And so I'm creating this, and I'm going to release it here into the wild. I'm going to release the essay version because I really want to put out there that this is something worth seeing if you care about looking at the impacts of trauma, looking at the impacts of trauma and vicarious trauma and vicarious burnout, caregiver burnout, compassion fatigue. This is really a metaphor for that. A therapist who allows a case to get to her so much so she enters into the trauma too much. So that's something we really have to consider, as the the hazards of this field. And so the real horror of the back rooms is a therapist giving up on a client. So openly admitting that she doesn't have a clue to help him change the behavior that he keeps stating is wired. So I think that's going to bother people on an unconscious level, like wow, or even a conscious one. And it seriously is such a testament to the film's tenacity and intellectual resolve that it it doesn't get satisfied with itself and rely just on jump scares or being in the back rooms. It's also a very heady film that focuses on real life mental dynamics. So it's tenacious in its unflinching portrayal of a person's response to the uncanny. And by uncanny, I mean entering in the back rooms and seeing something's wrong here. So there's plenty of shots that linger on the protagonist like Clark as he first enters into the back rooms. And I don't it doesn't do it justice to talk about the the back rooms without pictures and when Clark enters it, the mangled furniture that's all huddled together like this vulgar replication of Clark's furniture store. Everything in the back rooms is a cheap fax copy of a copy. It's all very wrong looking. So go see it if you want. It's not, as far as horror goes, it's not a lot of gore. Some blood, but that I'm gonna get some quotes too. I would love to uh let me see, get some clips from Dr. Mary, because to be honest, I love her psychological content, and I'm going to do more analysis of it. But I think I've got the material here to make a good article and transcribe it. But the backrooms as the collective unconscious of buildings that mattered to us and our versions of ourselves that are us at our most debased and unconscious and coarse. That's worth studying. It's worth looking at as a movie, and I hope you find it worth your time too.